So we've been talking about soil and how to determine your soil quality and how to amend your soil. And one of the best ways to amend your soil to make sure that you have a broad range of nutrients available to your plants is to add compost. And compost is something that you can make yourself. So in this section, I want to talk to you about how to compost. And I think there's going to be something here for everyone. So if you already have a compost set up, or if you're new to composting. If you've never composted before, I'm going to give you clear instructions from beginning to end to get you going. So the reason why we need to add nutrients to our soil is because we keep taking nutrients away from the soil. So every time we harvest, we're removing something from that network. In an agricultural setting or in a really active garden, we're using a lot of material from that place. So we need to offer something back. In nature, nutrients are constantly cycling, and every year a lot of plant parts are falling to the ground. So every time deciduous trees lose their leaves, those leaves get recycled back into the soil food web. And typically in agriculture or in an urban setting, every single year, people are not only harvesting, but removing what we think of as debris. So if in your garden, year after year, people have been raking the leaves away and taking them off site, you're actually losing nutrients from the soil. So it's important that we add nutrients back in, and composting is a great way to do that. Composting is a process that is the natural breakdown of organic material. So it happens regardless of us, but our role in composting is to try to manage the environment of the compost. So remember that we're relying on a lot of different organisms. Some of them are microorganisms that you can't even see with your naked eye, and some of them are macroorganisms like slugs and snails that you actually can see. There's primary decomposers, and then secondary and tertiary decomposers, and they each take a role in breaking down that material further and further. So all these different organisms are providing the means to break down the material, and they do that both physically as well as chemically. There's a lot of enzymes involved in the chemical breakdown, and there's a lot of organisms involved in the composting process overall. So your role as a composter is to manage the habitat of that compost for all of those organisms, and ultimately they're the ones doing the decomposing. So the way we manage their habitat is by affecting the moisture that's available to them and the oxygen that's available to them. So you hear people talk about turning the compost pile. So once you've got material in your compost, you need to make sure that you keep the airflow going, and you need to make sure that it's not too wet and not too dry. So we usually turn a compost with a pitchfork, and every time we do that, we are providing oxygen, and that oxygen is useful to aerobic bacteria that are helping with the decomposition process. And those aerobic bacteria in turn produce heat through their metabolic processes, and that heat helps with the breakdown of the compost. Also keep in mind though that every time we turn the compost, we're going to disrupt their habitat to a certain degree, and we're probably actually going to kill some of those little microorganisms. So it's a bit of a trade-off ultimately, but we definitely need to make sure that there's enough airflow in the compost. The other ways we can make sure that there's airflow in the compost is to have it in a container that allows airflow through it. So we want to avoid forming dense mats that are wet with a lot of material that's going to stick to each other. So layering in some slightly larger sticks will help to create enough airflow. And as far as the moisture available to these organisms, like I said, we want to make sure it's not too moist, not too dry. So if you live in a really, really wet area, then you might need to cover your compost, which we do here, particularly at certain times of the year. And if you live in a really dry area, you're probably going to have to actually water your compost. So providing those basic needs for those organisms that are your decomposers. So the next thing I want to talk about is what to put into your compost. So ultimately what we're looking for is a wide range of materials, and people talk about having greens and browns. So your greens are your fresh material. So things like your vegetable and fruit scraps from your kitchen, and fresh plant material from around the garden, fresh fallen leaves, fresh grass clippings, things like that. That's your greens. And then your browns are dried material, so dried grass clippings, dried leaves, straw, and ultimately we want to try to layer these in and have a good variety of both the greens and the browns, and that'll create a really healthy compost with a wider variety of nutrients. Other things you can add in, you can add coffee grounds, you can use eggshells if they've been rinsed out. You can add a little bit of hair here and there. You can add sweepings from the house if there's no bits of plastic or anything like that in there. So as much as possible, try to keep the materials you have, keep the resources that you have, and recycle them back into your system. What not to add, primarily meats and cooked or oily foods. Those will attract rodents and other kinds of animals into your compost. So try to keep it just at vegetable scraps and fruit scraps as far as your food waste from the kitchen goes. So for our compost, we're using a lot of our kitchen scraps, and that gives us a lot of the greens material, which is the nitrogen-rich material. And so we need to find ways to add a bit more of the browns, the carbon-rich material into our compost. And we do that by adding straw in. So like I said earlier, when we were talking about mulching, a lot of the materials that we use for mulching can be used as compost feedstock. So we use straw as one of our compost feedstocks. And then we also use well-rotted animal manure. So our compost heap is a lot of our kitchen scraps, vegetables, fruits, coffee grounds, that kind of thing, straw, and we're using chicken manure currently. So we layer those in and we turn our compost once a week. Whether you have a small space or a large space, you can get going. Just make sure you have a mix of materials that you're putting in there, and then try to turn it over on a relatively regular basis. And remember that you need moisture and you need air to support the microorganisms that are doing the decomposition for you. If you don't have space to have a compost heap like the layered method, you could consider doing vermicompost, which is to have a bin with worms that does the decomposition for you. And we're going to talk about that coming up.